The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the host and co-chair of this webinar. My name is Karen Mann, and I have my co-chair with me, Sadita Hassi, joining me as well. We represent the Human Development and Leadership Division of the American Society for Quality. This is a global division aiming to enrich the personal and professional lives of our members and non-members across the global community. We continuously look for new speakers within the range of our body of knowledge, which can be found in MyASQ, HD&L, community site. We host monthly webinars, so if you're interested or if you know of anyone that would be interested, we would be happy to review their application. Before we begin the webinar, let me go over some webinar rules. If there is any question or comment, please type under the question tab, and we will be answering the questions throughout the webinar time. The webinar is also held for 45 minutes, and in the very end, we have Q&A for 15 minutes. Those who attend the 40 minutes will receive 0.1 CEU through an email, which you can save and use it for your claiming the credit with ASQ. We are very delighted to introduce to you our speaker for today, and who will be our speaker for today, Jamelle Lindo. Hello?
Very happy to be back. Thank you.
I was just making sure everybody can hear
Hello.
me. For a second, I thought I got disconnected. Jamelle Lindo is an emotional intelligence leadership coach, trainer, and speaker for over 11 years of diverse learning and development experience. In his experience, he has worked with thousands of professionals across Canada to help them level up through the practical application of emotional intelligence and mindfulness-based strategies. Jamelle is certified in the World Assessment Tool for measuring emotional intelligence called EQI 2.0, and he uses this to establish a scientifically valid benchmark to begin the development journey. Jamelle is an official member of the Forbes Coaches Council, an invite-only organization for successful business coaches, and has been published several times on Forbes.com for various thought leadership pieces. Ultimately, Jamelle is driven by his mission to empower leaders and business professionals to become their best selves, and in doing so, achieve the kind of business success that makes the world a better place. Jamelle was with us a couple months ago with a part one on emotional intelligence. So today we're so happy to have him with us to take it further with the part two. So Jamelle, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you for the introduction. Also, thank you for bringing me back. I'm so happy that you guys found the information from the first presentation valuable, and I'm looking forward to expanding our knowledge base into it even a little bit further. And before we kind of jump in, I believe that I asked the same with you last time. I want for you guys to think about this through the lens of what you do each and every day. So the focus is going to be on emotional intelligence and self-awareness, of course, but ask yourself, how can I use this? How can I apply these strategies? Have I seen this scenario before? And what might this look like for me, even right after this meeting, when I go back to my busy day, when I go back to engage my team, when I go back to start working on processes or whatever the case may be? If you can think of it in that way, by the time we get to the end of the presentation and I start giving you practical strategies and techniques, you'll have a much better idea of how you can actually use some of these things in not only your professional world, but even in your personal world as well, because it's all connected to people. And so for those who joined us last time, really what I started with is painting the picture of the landscape of the modern world. And I'm going to do that really quickly today, because I know that the video is there and some of you have already seen it. I'm also going to do a very brief introduction to emotional intelligence and why it's important. But really where I want to focus our time and our energy is on understanding what self-awareness is, and even more importantly than that, learning about some strategies that you can use to enhance not only your service, but the self-awareness of people around you, the self-awareness of the leaders that you work with throughout your organizations. And the more practical that is for you, is the better it's going to be, because the easier it will be for you to be able to apply. And so there are three things you walk away with. Number one is the ability to define emotional intelligence, self-awareness, then describe the connection between self-awareness and leadership. And then, like I said, apply at least 2 to 3 strategies to enhance self-awareness. I'm going to give you a lot more strategies than just that, but if you can walk away with 2 to 3, it's great. If you can apply at least one, even today, that would be fantastic. It means that you're already starting a journey. And so before we jump
Jamelle, please,
yeah.
I think we're having a hard time hearing. Can you position yourself as in the beginning, because we couldn't hear much. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay now?
Not as bad as it was before at the very beginning.
Okay. How is my voice sounding now? Is it still unclear for you, or are you okay with this?
Yeah, it seems like you're somewhere far.
Okay, so it's the volume. Are you able to hear me any differently now?
It looks okay for now. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Feel free, Sadita, at any time to pop in. If I sound like I'm far away, once again, I don't mind making the adjustment for you. I want to make sure that you're hearing what I'm telling you. So to pick it up where we left off, I talked a little bit about the modern world, and I wanted to paint the picture of where we are today, which ties into why self-awareness is so important. So as we know, there's a lot happening in the modern world. There's a lot of technology, the advancements of technology significantly changing the way that we do things. More particularly, we see significant impacts in business. For example, the Netflix and Blockbuster situation totally has changed the way that we engage with online media and online content, right? Whereas before, you would go to Blockbuster, you'd get a video. Right now, it's becoming the norm for people to watch on demand wherever they want, whenever they want. And new television shows that are coming out on Netflix in some cases are more popular than what we see on very popular regular television networks. So a huge shift. Second example, we see what's happening with Uber, the taxi industry, right? Taxi industry has been relatively undisturbed for the last century, and now seeing a whole lot of disruption. Emotional intelligence is on the list, but more importantly than anything else, if you really take a close look here, you'll notice that it actually funnels down to 2 main skills: your ability to think and your ability to be able to deal with people. All of these skills fall down into those 2 categories only. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what about, education? What about job knowledge? What about technical skill? All of those things still remain important. They're still key skills. The difference is that they're threshold skills, get you through the door, right? But once you have the role and you've demonstrated the competency with your education or your technical skill or your experience, now you have to ask, what makes you any different from the person beside you, or the next person, or the next person? And so emotional intelligence is now the differentiator that makes you different. Because now it's a question of, okay, how do you interact with people? How do you deal with conflict? How do you handle stress? How do you mobilize others? How do you work within teams? How do you build relationships? These are the things that are going to separate the person who has the knowledge and the information from the person who's able to perform at a very high level within their role, particularly roles that involve people. And I'm guessing that that's going to be for all of us here. And so transitioning from that very quickly, I'm not going to touch on all of these, but I do want to quickly touch on why emotional intelligence is important and what some of them is telling us. The most important piece here being that 90% of top performers are also high in EQ. So we got to think about that. You may be a high performer. You may know a high performer. 90% of them are also high in emotional intelligence. EQ, 4 times more likely to predict career success, and the numbers go on and on and on. The last one talks about senior leadership and how EQ is a differentiating quality from one leader to another. So again, tied to what we were just saying around what makes one person different from the next in their performance. And so it all kind of boils down into this idea of emotional intelligence, and there are many different definitions and explanations for what it is. I particularly like to keep it simple. I just call it people skills, right? Daniel Goleman, he calls it the Synchronon leadership skill. More officially, emotional intelligence refers to your ability to use and manage emotions purposefully, both yours and others. And so we have to think about that for a minute, right? Because it touches on so many different things, and that's what we're going to talk about with the self-awareness piece. Okay. Now, if you see the term EQ, that's just referring to the scientific measure of EI or emotional intelligence. And so what's key for us to know in this is that emotional intelligence is not one skill, but it's an umbrella term for many different skills. The one that we are going to be focusing in on and learning a little bit more about today is going to be self-awareness. And I have to say, you know, self-awareness is one of those things that is so often misunderstood. It is so elusive. It is so challenging. And there are many different reasons for that. I'll talk about some of those later. But first, I want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what emotional intelligence is and what it really means to be a self-aware person. Okay, so this will kind of fit into the self-perception composite. This is the model that you can use to measure emotional intelligence. It's called EQI 2.0, and there are 15 different skills in total, 3 of which speak directly to your ability to be able to perceive yourself. So we call that the self-perception composite. So the first one on there is self-regard. Now this is interesting because a lot of people don't know that self-regard, which is basically self-confidence or a sense of self-esteem, is a part of emotional intelligence. That is how good you feel about who you are. It's your ability to be able to recognize your own skills, your own abilities in an accurate way. Okay, so that's one. The next one is self-actualization, and that's important too because that deals with your ability to be connected to a strong sense of purpose, right? A strong sense of mission, a strong sense of internal value. And when someone is on the route of being self-actualized, it's not just about what they're doing, it's about the impact that they're creating. And so when we have a conversation around leadership, we always see that the most effective leaders were always self-aware and seeking to become better and better versions of themselves. We see this in business, we see this in history. Essentially, an effective leader who's self-aware is not stagnant. They're not just in one place. They have a growth mindset and they're constantly developing from a sense of internal purpose. There's something that is driving them to do what they do. And the last part is emotional self-awareness, and that's just your ability to be able to identify what's happening with you on an emotional level at any given moment. Now, that sounds like it's an easy thing to do, but the reality is it can be challenging, especially when we're dealing with really stressful situations. And so let's define self-awareness first off. What is self-awareness really? We understand it's an umbrella term. We understand it's one of the skills of emotional intelligence. But more specifically, self-awareness refers to your ability to observe, understand, and manage your own thoughts, emotions, and actions effectively. So I'm going to stop here for a quick second, and I really want you to think about that definition. So understand at any given moment, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And how is that contributing to what you're doing? And also the ability to be able to manage that effectively, right? Now, there's a specific reason why this is more challenging than you might think. And I'm going to get into it in a minute when we jump into the case study. But for now, I want you to hold that thought. And I want you to ask yourself this question. This is going to come up as a poll in a minute that everybody can participate in, so we can get a feel for where everybody feels they are on this scale of self-awareness. But essentially, I want for you to identify, on a scale of 0 to 10, how self-aware do you believe that you are? Okay.
We have launched the poll.
Okay. We'll give you guys a second to do that, and then we'll pop back over to my screen in a minute.
As usual, pretty active attendees here. We have more than 65% voting. We'll give it a few seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sadita, I don't know if I'll be able to see that on my end, but if you could even just share the
I will
results,
share.
that'd be great.
I will share, yeah. Always interesting to see the results. How self-aware are we about self-awareness? That's interesting poll. Okay, so
Yeah.
we can close. We have 78% of people who voted. Let's see how they did. Okay, so we have 53%, 7 to 8, I am self-aware, following with 36%, I am somewhat self-aware. We have 9%, I'm very self-aware, pretty confident here, and 3%, I'm not self-aware at all. So those are the results, and that'll be interesting how this can change after the webinar. Thanks,
Okay.
thanks, Jamelle. We'll hide that.
Sadita, could you run the first one by me again, the first percentage?
Yes, the first one was 53%. I am self-aware, so it's your third choice. 7 to 8.
Okay.
Following
And
is the
so-
second one, 36%, which is 4 to 6. I'm somewhat self-aware.
Okay.
Your second choice.
Perfect.
And then you have 9 to 10, so that's your fourth choice. I am very self-aware, 9%.
Yeah.
And your first choice from 0 to 3, so low self-awareness, not self-aware at all, actually, is 3%.
Okay. So first off, special appreciation for all those coming in at that 3% not at all self-aware category. I don't know if this being anonymous might have contributed to that. Maybe it would be different if I was in the room with you asking the question. I don't know, right? So thank you for keeping it honest. And the 9% who are very self-aware, I'm super interested to see how this progresses. And interestingly enough, it does kind of fall into some numbers that I'm going to be sharing with you guys later on. But we can see by these numbers that the majority of us are falling into that I am self-aware for the most part category, with some coming in at the somewhat self-aware scale. So I want for you to just think about where you found yourself and where you marked yourself on that scale as we transition forward. And if there's time for Q&A at the end for us to kind of revisit the conversation, we absolutely will. And thank you again for your participation. And so,
yes, and Jamelle, 1 second here. So would you like to talk later a little bit about the tool you used for this, or it was just random? Because I'm getting a couple of questions here about that.
Yeah, could you run that question by me?
So yeah, like it is the measurement metric that's specific to self-awareness, or you just came up with some numbers so people kind of see where they find themselves falling?
Yeah.
or is it?
So I do touch on it later on. You can do
Okay,
it.
good.
Yeah, you can do an assessment to identify where you fall as far as self-awareness. There has been a tremendous amount of research that has been done in the category of self-awareness, particularly by Tasha Eurich. She studied self-awareness in leadership and has had a front row seat for the last 15 years. So there's a lot of information there. And there are some psychometrics that only measure self-awareness and nothing else. So I will touch on that in a little bit. All right, so what I want for you guys to do is a little self-reflection piece on emotional triggers. And I want for you guys to think of the last time when you were emotionally triggered. So what happened? What did you feel? And why? So I'm going to give you a quick second to identify this moment. It might have been this morning, you know, while you were coming in. There might have been traffic. It might have been a conversation that you had. It might have been in a meeting that you had, something that happened with a colleague, something that you needed to receive, you didn't receive it. It could have been you spent a significant amount of time on something and it wasn't needed at work potentially. Think of the last situation that you had where you were emotionally triggered. And I want for you to self-reflect and ask yourself, what happened? What did you feel? And why did you feel that way? I'm going to give you a few seconds to do that before I move on. Okay. If you have a scenario in your mind, the remainder of the workshop will be a lot more valuable to you because you'll be able to reference that particular situation. If you don't have a situation in mind, find one quickly so that you can get the most value out of this presentation. I'm going to be transitioning on. Okay, so when you think about, right, that emotional situation, whatever it may be, right, what you'll notice is that there's an event that occurred, whatever it may be. It could have been anything. It could have been something that somebody said. It could have been something that somebody did not say. It could have been an update that you received. It could have been an update that you did not receive, right? But that is the trigger event. And the moment that that happened, there was an emotional response. And you'll notice that that emotional response, it increases in its intensity, right? And then it reaches like a peak moment, like a climax moment. And oftentimes that's the moment where we act. We choose to say something, to do something, right? We are emotionally aroused in that moment. And then what happens after that? Well, eventually it kind of peaks off, right? And we come back to our senses. And then we can actually take a second to reflect. And so it'll look something like this. This is the 5 transitions of emotional experience, and it kind of walks you through this process. And as we go through it, I want for you to think about really how this happened for you, right? So what was the onset? What was the trigger? What was the moment, right? And then from there, at that moment, you go up into the ascent. So that is when the emotion is becoming more and more intense, right? Then it becomes the most intense in stage 3 at the peak level, right? And then it starts to cascade over, it dips off to the descent and then the offset. Now, the challenge with this is that depending on how significantly we get we could be frustrated, we could be angry. This works for positive emotions as well. That peak moment is typically the moment where we act. And the reason why that can be a challenge is because it's in that moment when your credibility as not only a leader, but as a professional, or even beyond that, as a person, is at risk. Because if you do the wrong thing, if you say the wrong thing, in those moments, you can damage relationships, you can damage situations, you can damage team dynamics, you can have an impact on projects. All of these things can happen. And if you think back to your scenario of when you were triggered, there's a good chance that you had that experience at that moment where you might have said something, you might have did something, right? So the question becomes, how do we recognize that? right? And how do we begin to deal with that? Keep this in mind. I'm going to give you a case study so that we can contextualize it, but then I'm going to give you some really practical strategies that you can use to then enhance your self-awareness so that you're not coming into scenarios and situations like this, okay? So this case study is about Sarah. I want for you guys to listen very closely and see if you can identify what EQ pieces are at play, but more specifically, the self-perception composite, okay? So Sarah is a senior leader at a rapidly growing startup technology company. She's incredibly smart, experienced, and driven. Her team looks up to her, and together, they've been able to accomplish some incredible things, especially within the past year. However, within the past few months, there's been a building tension between team members towards her that she is not aware of. This comes from the way that she delivers feedback. Sarah is a straight to the point kind of gal. When something goes wrong or a team member makes a mistake, she just calls it out without much consideration of how it might be received. In the last meeting, she raised her voice at Jim for misquoting numbers for one of their major client accounts. And this happened in front of the entire team. She continued to scold him publicly before correcting his error and telling him how to do it right. Going forward, Jim is definitely more careful because of his experience as well as others. But he's also less likely to bring forward any challenges he's facing for fear of humiliation. So I want for us to think about this through the lens of self-awareness, right? We all know a Sarah. Sarah might be Bill or John, right? You might be Sarah. No judgment if you're Sarah. I think we've actually all been Sarah at some point in our personal, professional lives, whatever the case may be, right? And so when we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, number one, is Sarah aware of the impact that she's having on her team? That's the first thing. That's a social awareness thing. But more importantly, is Sarah aware of what it was that actually triggered her? Second question, is Sarah aware of the emotion that she's feeling at that given moment? Is she able to identify it? Here's the next question. Is Sarah aware of what she might be thinking in that moment? Is she aware of what stories she's telling herself that is driving that emotion? Then we have to ask, is she aware of the action that she took and the impacts of that action? Was she aware? Did she have control? Did she know what was happening? And so when we go back, we take a look at this model again, right? We know that Sarah experienced some kind of a trigger event, right? So it could be, here we go again, right? And the story that she could be telling herself in this moment is that Jim never gets it right. Jim never pays attention. Jim is always out to lunch. Jim doesn't get it. And once again, Jim has messed up and made the mistake. If she's telling herself that story, and this is a story that she's probably told herself many times in the past about Jim, then she's creating that frustration and that anger. And so now when Jim makes a mistake, it becomes a trigger moment for her. And automatically she is snapping at Jim. But again, I come back to that question, right? Is Sarah aware of those thoughts? Does she even know that she has those ideas about Jim? Has she addressed it? Has she reflected to really figure out, you know, what is it about Jim that really upsets me? And see, we don't take the time to ask those questions because everything is happening fast. Everything is quick. Our calendars are packed. We're focused on the task at hand. We're focused on getting the job done. And so there's no time in our minds, what we believe, for self-reflection. Well, here's the interesting thing. There's no time for self-reflection, right? But how much longer now is this project going to take when Jim is not bringing forward ideas, when other people feel intimidated to bring forward ideas because the environment is not safe? when that behavior is now creating mistrust amongst colleagues even, where she's setting the stage for them and they're not collaborating in a healthy way. How much time are we wasting when that example of toxic behavior becomes the leadership example that people within the team then begin to demonstrate? And so they dissolve any trust between one another. How can I get a job done effectively if I don't trust my leader or the people that I'm working with? How much longer is this going to take? If I have a question, I don't know the answer to my question. Am I going to ask you? Well, probably not, because I don't know if you're going to yell or scream or be upset. Am I going to ask my peer colleague? Well, maybe not. They might humiliate me. So when we go back now, we can start to understand the real world implications of a lack of self-awareness. And it happens in a single instant, in a single moment. Credibility, safety, the quality of our culture can be destroyed. And once that's destroyed, how can we go about carrying forward a process, a new strategy, if people cannot collaborate and work together? And so when we come back to Sarah, chances are it's a lack of self-awareness. Because leaders, and I work with leaders all the time, guys, they don't intentionally go out there or set out to offend people, to upset people, to destroy the potential of what it is they're looking to create. That is never the case. It always comes down to a lack of self-awareness. And self-awareness is simple, but it's not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. And when I say it's simple, it's literally a matter of stopping and making a habit of asking those questions. What are my thoughts right now? In this case, Sarah is thinking, Jim always messes it up. Jim can't be trusted. Why is Jim even here? Jim doesn't know his stuff. He doesn't know his work. I can never count on Jim. Well, even if you look at those thoughts, we can be sure that there are times that Jim has come through. We can be sure that there are times where Jim has shown up. But we say in our minds always, we say in our minds every time, if you can't critically think and look at that and challenge your own thinking, then you're doomed to just believe whatever comes into your mind. And if that's the case, then you can really easily get sidetracked. And so I'm going to be going over with you guys some simple strategies and techniques to be able to do that. I've kind of touched on it a little bit now. At the end, for you to start developing the ability to self-reflect so that you can see what's actually happening within you at any given moment. So it's about identifying, number one, the emotion. What is the emotion that I'm feeling right now? Most of us just trail through our days without ever asking that question, right? And then number two, what am I thinking that's creating it? Once you have those two things, now you can be critical. You can challenge yourself. You can look at all different, more optimistic ways to look at a scenario to accomplish your goal. And so understanding everything that I just said through this lens is very helpful. I want for you guys to keep this in mind as I transition forward, because at the beginning, the onset, the trigger is key as well. And understanding that will be a part of the strategy that I'm going to be bringing forward in a little bit. But fundamentally, self-awareness comes down to your ability to be able to track what we're looking at on the screen right now. And it starts with understanding that your emotions drive your thinking. It informs the stories that you tell yourself. We're all telling ourselves stories. You're telling yourself a story right now. You're asking yourself in your mind, does this make sense? I don't know. You could be saying, yes, this does make sense. Oh my goodness, this happened to me. You might be saying, no, this doesn't make sense. I don't believe anything that Jamelle is saying right now. It doesn't really matter. The reality is you're telling yourself a story right now about this webinar and these ideas. And those stories come from an emotion. So it could be confusion, right? You could be feeling guilt because you're like, oh my goodness, this is me. You could be feeling excitement because it's like, man, I'm learning something that's new that's gonna help me. right? And that is going to drive your action. It's going to determine what you do. You might go out now and actually apply one of these strategies, right? And your actions are going to determine your results. It's going to determine what you get, what happens for you, and what doesn't happen for you. So everything has an emotional foundation. If we can't identify what that emotion is, chances are that we're creating results that are not the results that we want with ourselves and also with our teams. But this right here is the formula. This is what you need to understand to really dig into self-awareness, okay? And so, you know, coming back to Sarah, her self-awareness reflections really help her to see that she's coming from a place where she's overly assertive and not empathetic enough, right? And you can do that when you reflect, when you look back, when you ask a series of questions like the ones I'm going to give you in a moment. It will help you to be able to do that, okay? So earlier we did the poll. I asked you guys, how self-aware are you? This is anonymous. It might have skewed the numbers. I don't know. No judgment in either case. But most of us identify as being self-aware, and that's the case. But the research shows that the reality is only 10 to 15% of us actually are self-aware. Now, you might be asking, Jamelle, why is that? How could it be that of all of the people out there, only 10 to 15% of us are actually self-aware? And the answer is actually quite simple. You see, if I ask you if you're self-aware, chances are you're going to say yes, right? Or I'm pretty self-aware. But what if I ask your husband or your wife or your colleagues or your friends or your kids? How about your in-laws? Will they agree? I don't know. If they don't, again, no judgment, right? But basically what I'm getting at here is self-awareness is comprised of two parts. One is how you see yourself. The other is how other people see you and your ability to tap into that. The key is to be balanced in your self-perception, because you want to be mindful of how you're viewing yourself, but you want to balance that with how other people might be perceiving you as well. And there should be some element of consistency there. And that's actually where most of us falter. It's like we think we're self-aware, but then nobody around us thinks we're self-aware. And what does that tell us, of course, right? All right, so how do we actually begin to apply some of this stuff? What are some strategies that we can use to enhance our self-awareness within ourselves, but also for our leaders and those that we work with? So I already touched on some of these things, but these are the key elements. The most important thing to recognize about this is that self-awareness is a muscle. Think of it literally as a physical muscle. And so if you want to develop, let's say, your bicep, right? A webinar about how to develop your bicep is not going to develop your bicep. In the same way, a webinar about how to enhance your emotional intelligence or self-awareness does not enhance your emotional intelligence or self-awareness. It gives you tools and strategies that you can use. It's the practice of using these strategies that will help you to develop your self-awareness. Just like the practice of going to the gym will help you to develop your bicep. And so one of the things that you can do is just have candid conversations, let people know, look, I'm looking to develop my self-awareness, and I'd love to get your insight, I'd love to get your perspective on how I show up as a professional, as a leader in my personal life. And you have to preface this conversation with, I want you to tell me the truth. I'm not asking for compliments. I'm asking for the truth because I want to become a better human being. And what you tell me can help me to become a better human being. If you don't say this, people are just going to razz you. They're going to sugarcoat it, right? We live in a culture where people just want to make you feel good instead of telling you the reality of things, unfortunately. So you have to preface that. The next one is psychometrics. I'll talk about that in a minute. In coaching, we've talked about that already. Number two is probably going to be the most important thing. It's developing a lifestyle. And I say lifestyle because it's something that you do consistently, of self-reflection. So throughout the day, it's literally asking, what are my thoughts right now? What's driving me? Checking in with your body. What am I feeling at this given moment? Right? It's, again, asking, what am I doing? What is the action that I'm taking here? And what is the intention of my action? And if you can just develop this capacity to ask these questions that point your attention towards your internal experience, your self-awareness will automatically grow, because most of us are focused on what's outside of us, not what's inside. And then that kind of leads into challenging your own ideas with critical thinking. I talked about this quite a bit, right? You can ask yourself more questions and you can say, what facts support this thought or feeling? So Sarah might say, okay, I'm saying to myself right now that Jim always messes things up. What facts do I have to prove that? And then she'll think, you know, he doesn't always mess it up. Maybe he just has messed it up a few times when it really mattered. But like 90% of the time or 95% of the time, it's fine. That helps now for you to regulate that emotion, because that emotion is not even based in fact. But if you don't ask the critical thinking question, you will just believe whatever comes to mind. And that's the state that most of us are in the majority of the time. Right? The next one, B, what is the benefit of this thought or feeling? Right? So how is it helping me to be consumed by how bad of a performer Jim is? Is that helping me? Right? And if Jim really is that bad of a performer, what action do I need to take in that moment to address it, as opposed to passively reacting to it, but not actually getting to the root cause of the problem, or potentially not delivering the feedback that Jim needs in order to be able to truly develop? C, what is my focus? Okay, am I focused here on the problem, or am I focused on the solution? With Sarah, she focused on the problem, or she focused on the solution? Nothing in the case study mentioned anything about how she plans to solve or address this. She just reacted to it and moved forward. Now you can think back to your scenario, right? When you were frustrated, when you were annoyed, do you know what stories you were telling yourself that caused you to feel frustrated? Think about it. What were you saying to yourself? Now, how do you know that what you were saying to yourself is absolute fact? A part of emotional intelligence is called reality testing. It deals with your ability to be able to separate your emotions from reality, from fact. How do you know that what you were thinking was fact? Challenge it, critical thinking. And you see, if you're doing this exercise with me, you'll notice that you're starting to reflect on your internal experience. That's how you build the muscle. That's literally it. If you're doing it with me, that's literally it. Okay, some other development strategies. So I talked about this one, doing EQ assessment, right? I think we mentioned some of these other pieces as well. So these are things that you can train. These are things that you can give people concepts and ideas, and then through one-on-one coaching, which is number 3, you can help them to develop and build and grow the capacity. Just like having a coach in the gym, right? They come with you, they take a look at how you're doing it, they adjust your form to make sure that you're doing the practice in a way that is beneficial to you so that your muscle will grow. It's the same thing in this case. And these are really the main strategies. The only other thing that I wanted to mention is it's helpful, especially after the moment, because sometimes we get too heated in the moment to do some of these things. It's helpful to take a second to reflect and write out your triggers. What are your triggers throughout the day? What are the things that trigger you? If you did that every day for a week, you just wrote them down, you would notice that a lot of the things that trigger you are the same. Like if you're in traffic and you're upset by it, right? You were just as upset the day before, the day before, the day before, the day before, right? If somebody at work upsets you, if you can't get along with somebody at work, if there's tension, chances are that there's frustration and tension every time you see them, every time you interact with them. So in this way, you get to know yourself. What are the things that trigger me? And when you get to learn what these things are, then you can proactively be mindful of these situations and scenarios when you go into them. And just by having that level of awareness, you're much less likely to be triggered. Okay, very helpful. So we're at 2:45 now. I'd like to open this up for questions to see how you guys are interpreting the information and to see if there's any value that I can bring to you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much, Jamelle. This is one of the times, well, a few times, I don't want to open it up to questions because it was very great to hear you and listen to very, very practical and hands-on experience on not just becoming self-aware, but what do we do, how we recognize it. And as you mentioned, there is an assessment that might be helpful for people to do, which you mentioned here. And as we wait for the questions, which attendees can use the question box. So if you have any question, please, this is the time. In the meantime, would you share a bit more of the self-awareness assessment you just had referred here?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest one is going to be the EQI 2.0 because it's going to give you all of your emotional intelligence skills across 15 different skills. And so oftentimes when I do a debrief with that, people say, I didn't realize that I had this challenge with assertiveness. Low assertiveness is a big challenge.
Exactly.
Right, and so just by seeing that information, it's helpful. The other thing that's really cool is you can do a 360 version of the assessment. And so it gives you how you view yourself, but it also shows you the discrepancy between how you view yourself and how other people see you. So it's always interesting when you have someone that says, I am the most empathetic leader, all of my people care for me, and then the results come in and nobody agrees. Everybody thinks that they are not empathetic. And so now it becomes an area for us to have a conversation, right? And it's all about development and growth. It's not about singling anybody out. It's not about putting anybody down. It's just about having a good feel of where you stand so that you can develop in the areas that are going to be most beneficial to you as a professional, which then benefits the organization, but it also benefits you personally because these are people skills. They're going to be with you wherever you go, whatever you do.
And I even liked the slide you had. Actually, I pointed that out to the screenshot. You just had it there, like just think of the thinking portion, the feeling, and the action. So what am I thinking, feeling, and doing it, and comparing it to is this really true? Do we need it? So how is this impacting? That's a quick way as well. In terms of the 360, is there any specific that you recommend or where to find one that you would have experience with? So some people can do that with their teams.
Yeah, I would use the EQI 2.0. The EQI 2.0 though, it's a level B psychometric assessment, which means you can't just go online and take it. It has to be administered through a professional. You can find professionals who do it online. I do it. My contact information is there if you're interested in learning more. That's going to give you the most robust piece of information around this. But even if it's not this assessment, I mean, any psychometric that gives you insight into who you are and how you're showing up is going to help you to enhance your self-awareness. The key is for you to understand that this is a long-term marathon. It's not a sprint. It's just like going to the gym. You can't show up, twice a month and expect results. You have to ask yourself these questions on a daily basis, and then you get good at it, right? You start getting to a point where you're being triggered and you know you're being triggered, and so now you can choose your action instead of reacting. Think about the power in that. Like, how different would your professional life be if you could choose intentionally your actions? All of your actions.
We'll need all to go to meditation.
What was that?
We will all need to go to meditation. I feel like every time we touch these topics in the webinars, I think we take a lot of time to reflect on what we do.
No, meditation absolutely helps. Meditation is a great way to do it. Mindfulness is a huge way to do it. It's the same thing. It's about, identifying how am I showing up in this moment right now? Is this working for me or is it not working for me? And if it's not working for me, to what extent do I have, control to make this happen? And so if we go back to the example with Sarah, if Sarah was able to reflect in that moment and say, you know what, I just noticed that Jim just made another mistake, And she could be talking to herself in her mind, and she could say, I'm getting really frustrated right now, but you know what? I'm going to save this conversation till later, right? Let me just quickly make the correction.
Send the email tomorrow.
Yeah, let me make the correction. Let me just, take a second to cool off. Let's complete the meeting and I'll address this later. Imagine think of the power in that. Think about how much more seamlessly organizations would run if that's how people were conducting themselves, which is obviously not the case today. But the good news is that these skills can be developed, right? EQ, unlike IQ, can be developed. It can go up. You can choose to undergo that development journey. Do we have any questions, Sarita?
I have actually, as I'm speaking to you, I'm kind of transferring them into conversation, but they are part of the question. So another one is, so how do we correct yourself after you acknowledge you don't have a fact-based emotion in front of an audience? So now you became self-aware, but in that specific moment, is it this count until 10 kind of action that you need to take, or what else would you recommend in that moment you actually become self-aware in front of the audience? It's kind of too late, but still you can.
Is the question that you've become self-aware after having negatively reacted?
It's like, how do you correct yourself? Yes, yes.
Okay, well, that's where authenticity comes in. That's where being an authentic leader comes in. That's where being vulnerable comes in. You know what, guys? I can see right now I'm emotionally affected by this, right? And I know that we can all see this, right? And so I apologize for that reaction or that response. I think I need to take a second to really think about this, but just understand that my intention is positive. My intention is for us to be successful. And we can come back to this conversation in a bit. Right?
I mean, leaders are not perfect, so
you're not perfect. You're gonna, right?
Exactly.
And guess what? You have a conversation like that, people respect you because they're like, you know what? We understand that there's a lot of tension right now, and we respect that this person acknowledged it, right? That they took accountability and that they were open with us. Now you're building relationships. Now you're building trust. Now people can feel more open to being themselves and sharing what's actually happening. Look at what a different precedent you've set outside of reacting that way and then just acting like it never happened after you've just done damage.
And as you mentioned, the impact there, it might smoothen it up. And I have another question, which is kind of a mix of two. Both people talk about one person doesn't feel the emotions heavily, so maybe it's harder to understand and become aware because if he waits for the emotion doesn't come first, so it's hard to get there. The other person talks about unconscious bias, so it's both in the cases of being unconscious. How do people find out before, let's say they don't have that emotion and becoming aware of, I did something wrong because I'm not feeling anything? Obviously, if they do something, they don't feel it.
You can start at the more conscious level, right? So even emotions are technically subconscious, not unconscious, but subconscious, right? So your thinking though is conscious, your actions are conscious, right? The outcomes, even if you can't tap into that, look at your outcomes. What are you getting from the people that you interact with? Do you like what you're getting or do you not? Do you notice that people tend not to share when they're around you? Do you notice that you create a lot of conflict? Do you notice that people don't want to bring things forward? Like, what are the outcomes? And do you want those outcomes? And if you don't, then you can start asking yourself, well, what are some of the things that I'm doing that might be causing these things? This is where you start getting into the other elements. The other piece of that is you have to get feedback. It's really helpful when other people are telling you, hey, I don't know if you know this, but in that meeting just now, you came across as being very angry and very upset. It helps you to be able to recognize it yourself.
And I know this is, and you spoke about the feedback, which is actually helpful when you are not aware, and maybe the trigger comes from other people showing it to you. They might have the emotion and then show it to you, which has been provoked by you. Another question here, even though it's kind of now focusing on the other person who's not self-aware, and so how much do we focus on just self-awareness, and how much do we help others to become self-aware? So in the case you had there, Sarah, how do you help her if she's refusing, she's resisting to, or she's not self-aware? How do you transfer this to other people, like
Yeah,
that
so
they become self-aware? Do you focus on that?
Don't focus on other people. Do
And
not
that's what I
focus
hear
on
all
other
the time. So yeah, so
Do
that's
not.
hard.
If in this webinar what came to mind for you is that person's not self-aware, how do I get them self-aware? That means that you're not self-aware. Your focus is in
But
the wrong place. What
as
we
a
want to do
leader,
is, yeah.
and this is the
So,
trigger question here I get all the time, and myself as well, I struggle with. As a leader, you are this person that you want to help people become self-aware and then show the vision, and I'm not saying to show them how to get there, but you want to at least increase awareness. So now you are in this position where, and I hear this all the time, change yourself, don't change other people. But at the same time, there is an opportunity to be a guidance, to give. And then this is in the positive aspect of it. It's not trying to change them and then focus on yourself. Let's say you are not even part of it. What do you
yes.
do in this case? You just leave the person as is?
But you have to ask yourself, if you're not able to facilitate an experience of self-awareness within yourself, what right do you have to even try to facilitate that experience within someone else? So if you're not consistently, right, walking the walk, if you don't ask yourself these questions, if you haven't navigated that within your own experience, then how can you do that for someone else? Empathy is just an externalization of self-awareness. So you see how the self-awareness questions were, how am I feeling? How am I thinking? What did I do? Empathy is just you facilitating that exact conversation with someone else. That's how you build self-awareness within someone else. You're asking the same questions for them, which is empathy. You're tapping in now to their experience. But fundamentally, if you don't know how to use the tools with yourself, you will not be able to do it effectively with someone else. The second thing is, by nature of who you're being, if you really use the tools and practice self-awareness, by nature of your influence of how you show up, you will inspire people around you to start to do the same. They will notice you're not as emotionally reactive. They will notice that you're more balanced. They will notice that you're more reflective. You're setting the tone. That's the best form of leadership, is when you're not telling anybody to do anything at all. They just see you, and through the strength of your character, they're influenced. That's the place that you want to be. And you can only get there if you're focused on changing yourself and yourself alone. If you're blaming other people for how they're showing up emotionally, you will not be able to get to that place.
And you, not necessarily you are the person directly involved. Sometimes you are a leader, you are trying to solve a conflict between two people. So then that might be even kind of easier because you are not so much involved in the emotional portion there. So before, we only have 1 minute, but I wanted to see one more question here. So you can be too self-aware, I hear here, because you are fully aware. That's a bit too confident, but let's say you're fully aware of your triggers and why you're feeling the way you feel, and you are aware of how those you're interacting with are feeling. Then I may become paralyzed from acting if I am too self-aware, when maybe immediate action or verbal feedback is important. That's interesting. I feel like this is not direct feedback. This is on the feedback kind of topic though there.
Okay. So self-awareness doesn't prevent action. Self-awareness just means that you are perceptive as to what's happening. Right? If you're now not acting, then that's a lack of assertiveness. So what happens in that case is your self-awareness is out of balance with your assertiveness. It has nothing to do with self-awareness. Just because I know how I'm feeling at any given moment, it doesn't mean that I get stuck in that and now I can't act unless I have an imbalance in another skill, which is my ability to now be able to express. So another emotional intelligence skill is emotional expression, which is the same thing as well. So you have to balance those pieces.
And you had it there, like if you learn how to, as you mentioned, some of the questions, learn how to ask them maybe properly in the right tone and the right time, and try to find out or maybe increase their awareness as well, that could help. Jamelle, again, thank you so much. There are questions that keeps coming, and I want to remind attendees they can feel free to reach out to Jamelle. He's really good at what he does, as you saw, very practical, and it's hard to be practical in a webinar, so I'm very happy. It is showing more interest to keep going on with this topic, so feel free to reach him out. The contact is there. I want to thank you, Jamelle, again for being a second time, so we really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And we will be, I want to remind to everybody, we will be also recording tonight's presentation. Part 1 is already on the YouTube channel. ASQ HD&L webinars are there. This, yeah, and this one will be also a recording. Our next webinar actually is also posted. So in this case, we will have our past chair, Brooks Carter, actually joining us for the Power Positive Psychology. Our focus this year is to put a lot of topics that comes with emotional intelligence, emotions in general, how we lead ourselves and help other people, but also not just correcting, but also preventing. And positive psychology has that goal. On April 14, from 3 to 4 this time, Eastern time, we will be having this webinar. It is already posted on our My ASQ community page, so feel free to get there, or you'll get the newsletter if you're receiving newsletters from us. Notification, I know that you are interested in future webinars, credits or non-credits. This is open to everybody. LinkedIn page is always updated, so if you follow our LinkedIn page, you'll get future webinars notifications as well. Again, we do have 1-minute survey. It's like a couple of questions, less than a minute. It's really important because that's how we kind of find feedback from you and reshape the webinars, the future webinars. And it's not just about webinars. If you want to try something else and you do need something else from us, please feel free to share. We're working on a couple of different ideas on how to provide and deliver a value content for you. So one of them is might be doing a panel discussion, something else as well, case studies, but feel free to share your feedback in there. You will get 40 minutes or more. You will get a separate CU credit email. I'll be sending that tonight after 1 hour. We thank you again for your time tonight, and we look forward to having you on our next webinar. Thank you so much, Kiran, as well, for being here tonight as usual, and we look forward to see you again. Have a good night, everybody.